Då ber jag församlingen att sätta sig. Vi kommer nu att lyssna. Jag har den stora äran att introducera Leila Brännström som är docent vid juridiska institutionen vid Lunds universitet med en presentation som heter Abbasi i Stockholm, Judging the 1988 Prison Massacre from Afar. Varsågod.
Thank you. So, like Mariam, I'm going to talk about the sort of afterlife of certain events in the 1980s Iran, but I'm going to speak about them in a decidedly more prosaic register. On November 13, 2019, news outlets reported that Sweden had detained a 58-year-old Iranian citizen upon his arrival to Arlanda airport. He had come to see relatives. He was suspected to be the man who during the 1980s had worked under the codename Abbasi in various prisons in and around Tehran, and who had taken part in the killings of a large number of political prisoners, several hundreds, in a prison called Gohardasht in Karaj, outside Tehran, in 1988. So the man arrested was kept in custody until the trial began on August 10 last summer. He was charged for war crimes and murder, and his trial went on until May 4th, that is until 2 weeks ago. The trial has been one of the most extensive in Swedish history, with 92 days in court. 74 injured parties and witnesses were heard. They came from 12 different countries. Okay. And the court's judgment is awaited on July 14. The prosecution was made possible by extensive preparatory work of groups of exiled Iranian activists in Sweden and other parts of the world. Now, Trial International is an NGO that works to facilitate the prosecution of international crimes, such as genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The organization also maps developments in this area. In May last year, it reported that 30 trials concerning international crimes committed outside the jurisdiction of the state in which the trial was taking place were going on in 18 states around the world. They also reported that approximately 150 suspects were under arrest or facing trial for such charges, which would be the historically highest number. So the absolute majority of these trials are taking place in Western Europe, in France, in Germany, in Austria, in Netherlands, and in Sweden. And these countries are encouraged by the EU, have established specialized international crimes units in recent years. So these types of trials have been quite rare in the past. And I think it's not out of place to speak of a surge in the last few years of these types of trials. In the 1990s, there was this revival of the ideal of individual criminal responsibility for violations of international law. A number of international criminal tribunals and courts were set up. And in parallel, many states also put in place national legislation for prosecuting such crimes. And a number of prosecutions were also initiated in Western European states concerning atrocities that had taken place in other places, mostly in Rwanda and in Yugoslavia. However, after the initial flurry of activity, investigations and prosecutions remained rare and far between until a few years ago. And this recent wave, although wave might be an exaggeration, wave of indictments in Western European domestic jurisdictions doesn't involve political heavyweights as was sometimes the case in the 90s, things, for example, of the indictment of Pinochet or Ariel Sharon. Instead, the indicted are of lower rank and already present in the jurisdiction of the indicting state, in almost all cases as migrants in need of protection. The trials are taking place in states that host migrants from scenes of atrocity, who provide prosecutors with testimonies and other evidence of crimes. And another common feature, I would say, of these trials is the involvement of human rights organizations doing documentation and other things which later enables the prosecutor's work. So recently, two very prominent practicing international criminal lawyers suggested that their field is inherently politicized and that it is a fiction that trials concerning international crimes could be anything but political. Saying this, they actually echo what political theorists and critical international lawyers have been saying for many years. It is, however, important to see that what they are suggesting is not that these trials are political in the sense that the forum states, as represented by prosecutors, would target political or ideological enemies. Neither is it about courts deciding the cases in ways that would deviate from the rule of law. So the charge is instead about a range of subtler issues. For example, about the way in which human rights organizations, which, as already mentioned, play an important role in the build-up of cases, select the cases that they work on. Or about the fact that prosecutors rely on witnesses from diaspora communities that are the political enemies of the accused. So in other words, the charge is about these trials being instances of judicialized politics, involving politically motivated actors who aim for specific objectives and fight political opponents armed with legal arguments and resources. The notion that international trials are inherently politicized is, however, also about the politics of the past. So international crimes are committed in the context of larger political and social conflicts, and the truth about these conflicts and the issue of how they should be remembered are subject to intense disagreements. So these trials are about particular crimes being committed by particular individuals, but they are also settings in which stories about social and political conflicts are told and retold and entrenched. So since last August, I've been covering the Abbasi trial with a view exactly to look into these entanglements of law and politics. There is no doubt that the injured parties and the witnesses in the case, all former political prisoners or close family, are against the Islamic Republic. And those, such as the accused, who are loyal to the Republic. But what about the sort of country-specific human rights organizations that have been instrumental in enabling the trial? What about the expert witnesses? These are the kind of questions I'm interested in. The case also involves a number of contradictory narratives about the nature of the post-revolutionary state-building process in Iran, but also about the revolution itself. To cite Naghmeh Sohrabi, one of the last great successful revolutions of the post-colonial world, and one of the first to answer the questions and anxieties of its global South ethos in an Islamic form. So the project, as I mentioned, the trial only ended 2 weeks ago. So this is a project really in its beginning. What I'm going to talk about today are not conclusions and results, really. It's preliminary impressions. I'm going to give an account of how the trial played out. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the technicalities of how the charges were sort of designated and the consequences of that. And I want to bring attention to two circumstances leaving the remarks on the trial. And I imagine that it's also circumstances that leave their marks on trials of these kinds more generally. So the first one is distance, temporal, linguistic, and in terms of historical experiences. And the second is tension between the sensibilities of human rights activism and criminal law. But before going into that, I'll give some brief background about the Iranian Revolution and its aftermath, about the parties involved in the trial, and about the massacre. I tried to keep it to the minimum, just so the trial will become understandable. I'm not sure whether it's too basic and everyone knows this or not, but here we go. So until 1979, Iran was a monarchy ruled by Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. In 1978, massive rallies and protests against the monarch erupted throughout Iran. And I think that it's very difficult to tell the story of the way in which the revolution unfolded without anyone getting mad at you. So just to accentuate that this is sort of a contested story, I'm also giving you a screenshot from it's a video game called the 1979 Revolution Black Friday, which tells us in which you can sort of control this guy whose name is Reza, and then you can experience the revolution from the first person perspective. So that's an option. I'm doing a bit of commercial, it seems. Anyhow, so in the revolutionary process, I think it's many people from diverse walks of life and a variety of political parties, secular and religious, participated. And what united them was opposition to the authoritarian, corrupt monarch, subservient to the US, and then very general demands of liberty and right to self-determination. So a scholar of Iranian Revolution, Behruz Qamari Tabrizi, has pointed out that the vocabulary and images of Shia Islam gave the opposition a shared moral language, and that the vagueness and ambiguity of that language allowed the unity of different social and political groups. But also importantly, the uncontested leadership of Ayatollah Khomeini was also an important factor uniting the revolutionary movement. The effect of this state of affairs was that when what Charles Kurzman calls the unthinkable revolution actually happened, it was highly unclear what the post-revolutionary political order was going to look like. So what could be left in vague moral language before the revolution now needed to be spelled out. And very soon after the victory of the revolutionary movement, it became clear that different groups had incompatible ideas about what the post-revolutionary society should look like. So power struggles broke out. And borrowing a term from the historian of modern Iran, Ervand Abrahamian, I will call the formation which came out victorious from this process Khomeinists, an anti-imperialist, anti-communist, and anti-liberal formation. So the Khomeinists took over the state, its institution, and started using the repressive power of state against their rivals. So everything came to a head on June 20th, 1981, when the People's Mujahideen of Iran, I will call them Mujahideen hereafter, organized demonstrations in various cities around the country in response to the impeachment of the then president, Bani Sadr, who represented the opposition to the Khomeinists within the state apparatus. And Bani Sadr had sought the support and protection from the Mujahideen. So who were the Mujahideen? An organization that came into being in the 1960s as an urban guerrilla group operating against the monarchy. And to give a sense of what they were in 1981, I will quote from Ervand Abrahamian's 1989 book, Radical Islam, the Iranian Mujahideen, which, as far as I know, is the only book-length scholarly study of the Mujahideen, at least in English. So he describes them in this way. It was the first Iranian organization to develop systematically a modern revolutionary interpretation of Islam, an interpretation that differed sharply from both the old conservative Islam of the traditional clergy and the new populist version formulated in the 1970s by Ayatollah Khomeini and his disciples. Its ideas are in some ways comparable to those of Catholic liberation theology. Moreover, the Mujahideen, together with the Marxist Fedayeen, played an important role in fighting the Pahlavi regime, the monarchy. They provided the bulk of the political martyrs of the 1970s, effectively participated in revolutionary events of 1978-79, and helped deliver the regime its coup de grâce in February 1979. Furthermore, the Mujahideen grew rapidly after the Islamic Revolution to become a major force in Iranian politics. By June 1981, it could muster over 500,000 into the streets of Tehran. Its newspaper outsold that of the ruling clerical party by 16-1, and many foreign diplomats considered it to be by far the largest, the best disciplined, and the most heavily armed of all the opposition organizations. It's a picture of one of the leaders of Mujahideen, the one holding the gun, Ashraf Rabi'i, at the shooting range near Tehran in April 1979. So the response to the demonstrations held by Mujahideen was brutal. Here is the notorious first page of the daily Etela'at, which comes out in Tehran shortly after the demonstrations, in which the Revolutionary Prosecutor's Office of Tehran asks parents to bring ID in order to collect the body of their executed children whose photos are published but whose names are unknown. Basically, they were probably killed on spot. So the era of mass arrest and mass execution starting in June 1981. Mujahideen, on its part, retaliated repeatedly and were responsible for the assassinations of many senior government officials in the early post-revolutionary era. And the mass arrests and mass executions did not only limit itself to the Mujahideen and its supporters. Organization of ethnic minorities were also targeted, as was groups, members and supporters of a plethora of Marxist groups. The names are Tude, Fadaiyan Khal, Rah Karigar, Peykar, etc., etc., which had also participated in the revolutionary movement overthrowing the Shah. Here's a picture from an event organized by one of the largest ones called the Fadaiyan. So some of these Marxist groups had armed wings, others did not. Some supported the Islamic Republic, some did not. In the end, it didn't matter. So in this way, many of the revolutionaries from 1978 and 1979 were eliminated or ended up in prison. So in the video game, it's not very unsurprising that it moves, the video games moves between the revolutionary events of 78 and 79 and the interrogation chamber of the notorious Evin prison a couple of years later. Again, citing Abrahamian, he says that the Mujahideen, as the main foe to the Islamic Republic, bore the brunt of the government's crackdown, losing over 9,000 members in the 4 years after June 1981 alone. So after the 1981 crackdown, the Mujahideen went into exile and they established themselves outside the country, first in France and later in Iraq, which at the time was fighting a war with Iran. From 1986, the Mujahideen were stationed in a camp close to the Iranian border. after siding with Saddam, Mujahideen lost most of its support. Inside Iran, members were widely regarded as traitors. Many Iranians also described the organization as having evolved into a sect of some sort. To put it short, the organization became hugely unpopular among many sections of Iranian society, going well beyond the social base of the deep state in the Islamic Republic. So in the final days of the Iran-Iraq war, Mujahideen launched several armed attacks on Iranian armed forces, including an attempt to invade Iran on 25th of July 1988. And it is days after this attempt that prisons across Iran go into some kind of lockdown. So family visits are cancelled, prisoners no longer receive papers or can watch television, and thousands of prisoners associated with the Mujahideen, most of them had been in prison since 1981, and most of them were charged, they were originally arrested for participating in protest or selling Mujahideen's newspaper or some such crimes. They were executed after summary hearings by what survivors of these process called the death commissions. So the executions were secret. The bodies were buried in unmarked mass graves at night, like the one that Mariam showed. Khavaran is probably the largest one. Families were given personal belongings months later, but most of them did not receive any information on where the family members were buried, and they were ordered to abstain from mourning them in public. So later, the then designated successor of Khomeini, Ayatollah Montazeri, who championed a softer approach to political prisoners, revealed that the operation was set in motion after an order issued by Khomeini to execute everyone having remaining loyalties with the Mujahideen. But there was also a second wave of prison execution, which began a few weeks later, when prisoners affiliated with Marxist groups were questioned by this death commission, this time not about their political affiliations, but about religious beliefs, whether they believed in God and whether they were Muslims. And those who responded incorrectly were executed. So in a 2018 report by Amnesty International, they estimated the number of prisoners killed during these two waves of execution at a minimum of 5,000, but suggest that the numbers could be much higher. Iranian officials have, over the years, mixed blanket denials about these executions, with statements seeking to downplay or justify them. So it took some time before knowledge about the executions became more widespread. So survivors, family members, and others have since the early 2000s, especially outside the country, worked to draw attention to the prison massacres and more broadly to the torture and killing of political prisoners in the 1980s Iran. So these are pictures that I have taken outside the district court in Stockholm. This during the last few months. As you can see, what is usually referred to as the justice-seeking movement have adopted the means of expression of transnational human rights actors. I think that the Argentinian case comes to mind. And some years into the 2000s, a number of Iranian human rights organizations based in exile in Western countries also started to document the prison massacre, mostly by taking up witness testimonies. And to lend more legitimacy to their work, they also collaborated with internationally recognized jurists and organizations. And they also organized a people's tribunal, focusing on the 1980s as a whole. What I'm trying to say is that by November 2019, when Abbasi was arrested at Arlanda, the massacre had already been translated into the human rights vocabulary, and qualified lawyers had produced juridical evaluations of it based on documentation that was gathered by grassroots groups and more professionalized Iranian human rights groups. Amnesty International had also produced a report in cooperation with Iranian Germany-based human rights organization called Justice for Iran. So Abbasi is the first person ever to have been put on trial for partaking in the 1988 prison massacres, or in fact, more generally, in the elimination of political prisoners during the 1980s. So the prosecution, they claim that the accused, when he was stationed at Gohardash prison and acting in his role as an assistant to the representative of the prosecutor's office in prison, he aided in the mass execution of prisoners by selecting which inmates would be put before the death commission, by bringing the selected inmates to the so-called death corridor where they would wait to meet the death commission, guarding them while they were in the corridor, reading aloud the names of prisoners who were to be brought before the commission, sharing information on the prisoners to the commission, reading aloud names of prisoners due to be executed, ordering prisoners to stand in line to the execution site and escorting them there. Through these acts, the prosecution suggests that the accused committed war crimes with regard to prisoners associated with the Mujahideen and murder with regard to prisoners associated with Marxist political organization. So the difference has to do with the fact that at the time there was nothing akin to an armed conflict going on between the Islamic Republic and these Marxist groups. So the prosecutor argued that the crimes in question would qualify as crimes against humanity, but could not be classified in this way because crimes against humanity has existed in Swedish law as a crime since 2014 and cannot be applied retroactively. So basically, in other words, there was a lack of temporal jurisdiction. So, as mentioned, parts of the atrocity were instead classified as war crimes, which makes it juridically necessary to establish link between the prison massacres and the military operations carried out in the immediate aftermath of the Iran-Iraq war by the Mujahideen. And because of that, the military operations, they feature very centrally in the prosecutor's account of what had happened. And that would probably not have been the case if the crimes would have been classified, for instance, as crimes against humanity. So the juridical classification frames how the historical narrative unfolds at the court. There has been a long-standing discussion on the actual reason for the 1988 massacres. So many former prisoners and survivors are convinced that the executions had been prepared well before the Mujahideen offensives. And they suggest that perhaps the executions were some kind of final solution to the problem of political prisoners who refused to repent. And repenting was sort of an objective to be achieved within the prison system in the 1980s. So the juridical classification of the executions as war crimes and the association of the massacre to the armed conflict comes across for many people as something which obscures the nature of how the Islamic Republic looked at its political enemies. In the case, the Mujahideen, which is, is nowadays actually based in Albania, of all places, they have their own legal counsel, which represents them. And in my understanding, what is at stake for the Mujahideen is their reputation and their understanding of history. So one legal issue central in the trial is whether the armed conflict between the Islamic Republic and Mujahideen can be classified as an international armed conflict or as a non-international armed conflict. Or depending on this classification, two separate sets of legal norms will become applicable, and the classification as international armed conflict is in many ways more favorable for the injured parties in this case. But such a classification would stress the coordination between the Mujahideen and Saddam Hussein's Iraq. So, which is not something that the Mujahideen organization wants or believes is true. So they want to downplay the degree of coordination, and they want to emphasize that they operated much more autonomously. The legal council of the Mujahideen has also raised the question of whether the killings should be classified as genocide. So in fact, a number of jurists have argued that the massacres should be seen as genocide in the case of the Marxists, genocides against atheists, and in the case of Mujahideen, genocides against a different variety of Islam. So the Council of the Mujahideen describes the organization not only as a political organization, but as a religious reform movement. And a number of people have approached the prosecutor in this case and asked her, why not genocide? And if I have understood this communication correctly, her opinion is that they cannot prove intention of genocide. So finding intention in legal context is never a question of soul searching, but about what is said and done, what is empirically verifiable. And this brings me to the question of distance. And the question of to what extent the inability of the prosecutor to be able to prove such an intent has to do with the difficulties of the prosecutorial team to navigate the context in which the massacre took place. So what I'm suggesting is that the proof of intent may well be out there, but the prosecutor has no means of finding it. How long have I talked, René? Do you know?
Yes, you are a little bit ahead of the program, I think, so maybe, I think 20 minutes.
Oh, that's good.
So you have
Lots of time. Good. Okay. So, I'll keep going about distance. So I think that the political complexities of trials concerning international crimes, which are held where atrocities are actually committed, for example, in Argentina or in Rwanda, they differ from the ones that take place at a distance. So domestic trials in transitional justice settings, in home jurisdictions, they're marked by the fact that the perpetrators and the victims continue to coexist in the same territory and the same polity. These trials take place in the shadow of, on the one hand, the risk that the perpetrator group, for example, the military in Argentina, could exercise violence, and on the other hand, the potential of victim groups to use trials for past atrocities to consolidate a new regime, as appears to be happening in contemporary Rwanda. In contrast, the Abbasi trial is in every respect marked by distance from the conflict, geographically, linguistically, culturally, and in terms of historical experience. So in this respect, the case is much closer to the trials held by international courts and tribunals. And one feature of this trial, which I think still makes it different from those international tribunals and courts, is the active participation of the diaspora community. So it's, I think, 80,000 people live in Sweden who were born in Iran. Many of them have personally experienced being detained and tortured in Iran, or have family and friends who've been tortured or executed in the 1980s. Sweden is, in fact, the Western country with the most number of per capita inhabitants originating from Iran. And Sweden has been one of the main locations from which attention has been drawn to the killing and torture of political prisoners in Iran in the 1980s. And the presence of the Iranian diaspora in and around the court matters. So I'll just give you some very small examples. So one is about interpretation. So the court sessions, they have been broadcasted and it has been possible to follow them online via live audio. So there is a relatively large group of people, both in Sweden, but also in Iran and in other countries, who've been listening to the trial. Now, the people who live in Sweden many of them are bilingual. They speak Persian and Swedish. And in the beginning of the trial, there were lots of problems with translation. So the two translators struggled, but a lot of times not successfully. And we know, those of us who have, for instance, worked with refugee law, that translation is a difficult issue, that the first time that you meet the police, you say things, and then it's perhaps not correctly translated, and then you can never get rid of those misinterpretations. But this context is, of course, different because it's so public. There's so many people following it, so people started making notes, sharing notes, giving notes to the legal counsels, etc. So there was this interactivity going on. And somehow two things happened, I think, in the trial. One was that the interpretation improved because everyone also talked to the interpreters. And the other thing was that because the question of interpretations kept being raised, and it kept being raised because there was all these bilinguals around, the members of the court realized that translation is mediation. They started sort of understanding that it's not just something that is transparent. They started asking other kind of questions and sort of counting that there could be things lost in translation, basically. So the action of the legal actors in the courtroom changed, and this interactivity could also be seen in a different sense. So the one effect of this distance, and it's not just the geographical distance, but it's the inaccessibility to the site of crime. So basically, we're talking about things that are happening in this confined space in the Gohardash prison, and nobody, we don't have. There's no possibility to go and look at it, which is something that you do when there has been some kind of regime change, of course. So there are no archives. No on-site visitations. So the only thing that the court has to work with is testimonies. And the question of what this building looked like, it became a big question. Like someone was going, it was impossible to understand what the witnesses were saying because you couldn't navigate how they. So what happened was that there was this group. Now I'm losing it. No, exactly. They built this model and donated it to the court. So it's actually the Mujahideen Albania who built this and sent it over as a gift. And then the witnesses would, it popped up around 2 months into the proceedings. And it's just one example. There has been also lots of examples when you talk about objects which are sort of culturally not really understandable from a sort of Swedish point of view. For instance, there's a lot of talk about, was this person, how did he dress? Was he dressed in military clothes or in civilian clothes? And everyone kept saying that he had this military overcoat. And the question was, so is it civilian or is it military? Was he uniform? Was he not uniform? And I think that for everyone who's been living in Iran in the 1980s, there is this thing that these sort of uniforms were very common. And it's not really clear whether it's civilian or military. This is actually the current president of Iran in his youth. wearing one of these uniforms. So someone brought a uniform to the court to make this point. Of course, this generates problems too, because everyone coming to the court to offer the narrative had already heard, almost all of them had heard what has been going on. So there is this sort of what the defense calls contamination of memories and narratives, etc. So the fact that the main evidence is testimonies creates a focus on credibility. And this takes us to the question of political motivations, which is the main defense strategy. So the defense is basically saying that these people are willing to witness against any representative of the Islamic Republic. Also, they're pointing out that not only the injured parties and the witnesses have this political motivation, but also the human rights organization. And in particular, the sort of human rights organization which are country-specific and work towards Iran. So they keep making the point that these organizations are not actually neutral, but part of this disagreement, part of the dispute. And here I think they also borrow from another case, a much larger case that is going on at the same time, which is the Lunds case, in which there is a sort of a cross-fertilization between the defense attorneys of the two cases. So in the Lunds case also, the sort of the questioning of the human rights or actors, and pointing out that the human rights actors are part of this agreement rather than neutral standing outside has been one of the main arguments. And this goes on, the question of whether experts are neutral. And here there is also a problem that the prosecutors operate in the dark. And that's also part of this distancing. So it seems that a lot of people are contacting the prosecutors and want to come and become experts. And prosecutors don't know how to navigate that. They cannot distinguish between people who are experts and people who are wannabes. And it also has to do with the fact that compared to certain other kinds of atrocity trials, there is not much written on these things, like historical research. So for instance, if we go back to the question of whether the sort of a coordination between the Mujahideen and the Iraqi state, at what level that was, and how to judge that, whether it's a coordination to the degree that would make this conflict an international conflict, there is very little written on the history of this armed conflict. There is basically nothing to build things on. So I think it's just, and I think it's common when it comes to conflict in the third world, that you don't have a Harvard Institute doing work on this, which then, makes it even more difficult for the prosecutors. So the last thing I want to mention is and I will just talk about it very shortly, is the tension between the anti-impunity oriented and victim-centered human rights sensibility and the rule of law oriented criminal law sensibility. So in the documentation which has been produced by human rights organizations, testimonies are usually not questioned. So, and that is of course not the approach of the defense lawyers who chase contradictions in and between testimonies and are always careful to say the alleged executions, the alleged sites of burials, etc., etc. So the expectation of people with human rights sensibilities is that justice is done if the accused is convicted. otherwise not. Which is, of course, a sensibility which runs the risk of going in the direction of preferring and wanting shadow trials, show trials. On the other hand, the criminal law sensibility, it comes close to atrocity denial sometimes, and to victim blaming and problems of that sort. I leave it at that and see if you want to pick up anything from what I've said so far. Thanks.
Thank you, Leila. Then we open the floor for questions, remarks, comments.
Thank you very much for your nice talking about this. But can I ask you, do you know what exact, of course, with my total respect to all people who have been in the Iranian prison, fängelse, I mean in Swedish, which have been killed there. Do you know what it means, exact mujahideen khalq? I mean, the word is an Arabic word which is coming from jihad.
The mujahideen, yes. I think you're asking where the name comes from.
Please. I want to ask, did they believe on democracy for Iran, or they want just to have another system, another Islamic system for Iran? And my another question, why they choose Saddam Hussein's side? I mean, during this war, 8 years war between Iraq and Iran, why they choose another dictator, which was Saddam Hussein, and why they fight with this dictator killed?
I can just say very shortly that I can't speak for the Mujahideen organization. I'm not a member or supporter. But shortly I can say that I know where the name comes from. And the name was, I think it's actually a third worldist sentiment. So they took the name from the Algerian Mujahideens. So rather than, I think, sort of a... they were inspired basically by the Algerian Mujahideens in the 60s. So that's where. But regarding what the choices they made, I have no clue.
More questions, remarks?
Thank you for your presentations. Fascinating. This kind of very neat description of different parts. And while it is very clear why the diaspora wants, and how the system has problems adapting to this situation, this kind of proceedings that they haven't done before, and so they struggle in which way they are going to handle it. It is not very clear to me why the state, the Swedish state, or the states that you mentioned are doing this since a few years ago. Why they do this? What's the effect? What do they produce?
So I think that there are two explanations that usually are brought up. So one is migration control. So it's a way of policing so basically there's a lot of sort of policing of the asylum seekers, which is justified in the name of anti-impunity, I would say. So I think there is some... But the other part is, of course, there's the sort of a do-goodery. You think that you're doing good in the world. I think that's... But then, of course, it gives you diplomatic problems, which this case has generated. And there are indications that maybe the prosecutor's office responsible for the international crimes, should be more restrictive in which cases to pick up. It's because they have costs. They have diplomatic costs. which states, I mean, for instance, in the 90s, Belgium had this this kind of legislation which would allow for prosecution in Belgium of people who were not on the territory. And that's like where, Ariel Sharon came into the picture, etc. And then the Belgian state got into lots of problems because they, I think it was, I can't remember which one of the American Foreign Office people, but there was a range of people so the state couldn't handle it. So the legislation was dismantled very quickly within a few years because it caused too much problems. So I think that this limitation that you will only take on people who are already on your territory is a way of sort of safeguarding for some. But this case is very particular because most of the time the people who are suspected and tried, they have come, like in the Syrian cases, there are refugees basically. This guy was a tourist. And I think it makes a difference. It makes a big difference because the state, the Iranian state, is sort of supporting him, support of a sovereign country, which most of these other people don't.
Thank you so much, dear. It's a fascinating case. And it still remains to think what happens. I would like to ask you to kind of contemplate a bit more about you pointing out how the language became a mean of mediation and things going lost in the language. Because one of my experiences was also there wasn't so much the lack of language as such, meaning Swedish, vice versa, Persian, and the kind of the cultural sphere around the two languages, but rather the lack of language as a consequence of the juridical system trying to frame and redefine experience as witnessing, as evidence, experience as evidence. And searching for this kind of constantly searching for a way of seeing where this very nice model which you showed comes into the question. So the juridical system was asking for the concreteness of the experience, while the former prisoners could stand there and tell how they couldn't see anything since they were blindfolded. So asking a blindfolded witness to witness about the concreteness of the building. So that kind of lack of language, rather as I kind of interpreted it, or I don't know, could you see that also that one changed somehow during the process, and what happened, or what were you thinking about the mediation of the language? So thank you so much.
Thanks for the question. I didn't talk about that because I'm not sure what to think about it, because it was quite obvious to me. The situation is, so I think that the juridical systems lends itself better for certain types of crimes and problems than others. It's the massacres we're talking about. They were executed in secrecy, and the prisoners were a lot of time blindfolded. So I'm not using the proper name of according to sort of Swedish tradition, I'm not using the proper name of the accused person, but his prisoner code name. But this also tells that all the prisoners had code names, or the guards, or the people working. So there is so much disorientation, so difficult for them to sort of. So it's one aspect of why sort of the narrative that comes out from these testimonies, while coherent in many ways, also is not as clear and as concrete as I think a judge would wish it to be. And possibly, it's a possibly feature of these sorts of crimes more generally, but in this case it's very obvious that the conditions, so in a sense, this kind of measures of keeping the prisoners in the dark, to say so, was of course not because there was a fear of judicial proceedings in the 80s. It wasn't. It was retaliation, of course. But the effect is now being seen that lots of these people, you know, they haven't been around. They haven't seen properly the location. There's all these kind of things that are a consequence of the fact that they were held epistemologically on a tight leash. Yeah. So I think but then this is a general problem with law, that you translate experiences to the legal language, and it doesn't, you know, you have the same problem in discrimination cases. You have the same problem. So I think to me it's kind of normalized. As a person who's been working in the field for many years, perhaps I'm not paying that much attention. So I think whereas the sort of translation between two actual languages has this newness to me. So I'm aware of what you're talking about, but I think it's is a general feature of sort of translating life to law.
Yeah. Just 1 minute. Thank you so much. Definitely, I can completely agree, but still, if you compare this with, for example, Nuremberg trials or the trials of Nazi crimes in Russia, where actually this embroidered affective space of experiences were actually used as a mean, since you couldn't really witness. It was like not being able to actually witness made it possible, and compare it to this kind of framing that we have here now, where all kind of what is experienced as affective is excluded from the kind of the conversation. But we can get back to that later on, maybe during the conversations.
Okay, we have two last questions, very short, and then we take them together, and then you can answer.
Okay.
Your words, Amma first.
I just want to know now how we all can do it globally. Now a lot of young girls are still in the prison, they're tortured to death. So what you all can do globally?
What you can do?
You can take this last question and you can answer.
Well, I just wanted to hear, do you think then that this development of having trials in national context has been an improvement of transitional justice as a sort of like this general trend?
Yeah, asking very difficult normative questions. So the first one I can't answer. I mean, you know, I just can't. I have my ideas, but they're not better than anyone else's. And the second, I guess, I don't know. I think these cases are very difficult. I think there's something I haven't talked about is this whole post-colonial context that these trials are going on in. And I feel quite ambivalent about this. So there has been this experience of following this trial, and the sense, I mean, the people who've been sort of following this trial and have been coming to courts and listening to it and engaging in discussions about it, it's very clear to me that there's a sense of joy, which I'm happy about. I can't say anything else about that. But then, you know, as a general sort of, there is this uncanny thing about, you know, the way in which Western states appear as moral arbiters of atrocities in the third world. I can't say anything about that either. So I think I'm very ambivalent about all of this.
Thank you, Leila. I think we will thank you for this presentation.
Thank you.